After 20 years of marriage, my husband confessed, "I love your sister. We have been together for 3 years." I quietly smiled and sent one text message. What she saw on her screen made her turn pale. "Good day, dear listeners. It's Diana again. I'm glad you're here with me. Please subscribe to my channel and like this video, and also let me know in the comments which city you're listening from. That way I can see how far my story has traveled." People always said Rick and I were the couple that made marriage look easy. 20 years. That's a long time to be wrong about someone. We met in college. He was studying finance. I was in architecture school, and we collided over a shared table in the campus library during finals week. He had this way of looking at you like you were the only person in the room. I fell for it completely. We married young, built something real together, or so I thought. We bought a house in Asheville, North Carolina, a craftsman bungalow I helped renovate myself, right down to the custom cabinetry in the kitchen. We raised 2 kids, Nathan, now 19, away at UNC Chapel Hill, and Sophie, 16, still at home. I ran my own small architectural firm. Rick managed investments for a regional wealth management company. We had date nights on Fridays. We had inside jokes. We had a life. And then we had cracks. Looking back, the first signs appeared somewhere around year 17, though I didn't recognize them as signs at the time. Rick started working late more frequently. Not every night. That would have been too obvious. But in a creeping, gradual way that I rationalized easily enough. His firm had taken on new clients. The market was volatile. He was ambitious. These were the stories I told myself, and they fit neatly into the portrait of our marriage that I wanted to preserve. But there were smaller things I couldn't fully explain away. He started going to the gym before work, which was new. He bought a bottle of cologne I didn't recognize, something sharper, younger smelling than what he'd worn for years. He became protective of his phone in a way that felt performative, turning the screen face down whenever he set it on the counter, angling it away from me when he typed. I noticed. I said nothing. I told myself I was being paranoid. My sister Carol had always been the beautiful one in our family, 3 years younger than me, with the kind of effortless charm that made people lean toward her in conversation. We'd always been close enough that I'd asked her to be my maid of honor, close enough that she spent every Thanksgiving at our table, close enough that she had a drawer in our guest room she called hers. She was between long relationships, perpetually. She said she was picky. I admired that about her. The unease started crystallizing about 8 months before everything fell apart. Rick and Carol had always gotten along well. Too well, I sometimes joked, though the joke never quite landed the way I intended. But that autumn, things shifted in some subtle register I couldn't name. They started finishing each other's sentences at family dinners. There were inside references I wasn't part of, a restaurant they'd apparently both been to, a podcast they'd both apparently started listening to. When I mentioned it once, lightly, Carol laughed it off. "We just have similar taste," she said. Rick agreed. They shared a glance that lasted half a second too long. I began watching. Not obsessively, not yet. But I started paying attention the way you do when something low in your body signals danger before your mind catches up. I noticed that Carol texted Rick directly about logistics, what time dinner was, whether to bring wine, rather than texting me. I noticed Rick's face when Carol walked into a room, a fractional brightening, a small unconscious adjustment of his posture. I noticed that when the 3 of us were together, the energy between them had a frequency I wasn't tuned to. Still, I didn't confront it. What would I even say? The night everything became undeniable started like an ordinary Saturday in March. Sophie was sleeping over at a friend's house. Rick and I had dinner at home, pasta, a bottle of red, quiet conversation about nothing important. He seemed distracted, but not unusually so. We went to bed at the same time. In the middle of the night, I woke to use the bathroom and noticed his phone lit up on the nightstand with a text preview. I didn't mean to read it, but the name was Carol, and the words I saw in that half second were enough. Miss you already. Tonight was... The screen went dark. I stood in the bathroom for a long time with the door closed and the light off. I didn't cry. I felt something colder than tears. A stillness, like the moment after a car accident when your body hasn't yet processed what happened. I went back to bed. Rick was asleep. I lay beside him and stared at the ceiling until it was light outside. 2 weeks later, he sat across from me at the kitchen table. Our kitchen table, in the house I had designed with the cabinets I had chosen. And he told me. He said he hadn't planned it. He said it had happened gradually. He said the words I never imagined hearing. I'm in love with Carol. We've been together for 3 years. 3 years. Sophie had been 13. Nathan had been 16. I had been making their lunches, running my firm, renovating the back porch, living a life that was apparently already over without my knowledge. I looked at him for a long moment. Then I smiled, not warmly, not bitterly, but the way you smile when the answer to something finally becomes clear. I picked up my phone and sent one text. Carol read it and went pale. The text I sent Carol that night was simple. I know everything, don't call me, don't come here. I'll be in touch when I'm ready. 7 words of instruction and 1 sentence of warning. I watched the read receipt appear almost immediately. She didn't reply. Rick, sitting across the table from me, had no idea what I'd just done. He was still talking. Something about not wanting to hurt me. Something about the kids. Something about hoping we could handle this with maturity. I set my phone face down on the table and looked at him with an expression so composed that he stopped mid-sentence. I need you to sleep in the guest room tonight, I said. That was all. He opened his mouth. Then he closed it. Then he picked up his wine glass and carried it down the hallway. The door clicked shut behind him, and I sat alone in the kitchen I had designed, in the house I had built with my own choices, and I allowed myself exactly 20 minutes to feel the full weight of what had just collapsed. I cried once, hard, with my face pressed into a dish towel so he wouldn't hear. Then I stopped. The days that followed were among the strangest of my life. A kind of doubled existence where I functioned entirely normally on the surface while something entirely different was happening underneath. I drove Sophie to her Saturday dance class. I attended a client meeting about a mixed-use development in downtown Asheville. I answered emails. I texted Nathan a photo of his childhood dog sleeping in a sunbeam, the way I always did when I missed him. Nobody looking at me from the outside would have seen anything unusual, but inside, I was doing calculations. 20 years of marriage meant a great deal in terms of what North Carolina law calls equitable distribution. We owned our home outright, no mortgage, having paid it off 4 years ago. Its current appraised value was $740,000. Rick had a 401k with roughly $380,000, a brokerage account, and a pension from his previous employer. We had joint savings. My architectural firm, which I had built from nothing 11 years ago, was legally considered marital property to whatever extent Rick had benefited from my income during our marriage. Though I intended to argue strenuously on that point, I wasn't afraid of the numbers. What frightened me was softer and harder to measure. The thought of telling Sophie, the thought of calling Nathan, The thought of sitting across from my mother at Christmas and watching her process the fact that her younger daughter had spent 3 years sleeping with her older daughter's husband, the social geometry of it, who would have to know, what they would think, who would take whose side, that was the part that made my chest tighten at 2 in the morning when I couldn't sleep. But fear, I had learned a long time ago, is not the same as paralysis. The morning after Rick's confession, I called my attorney. Her name was Patricia Holt, and I had known her casually for years through professional circles. She'd done the contract work when I incorporated my firm. I didn't tell her everything on the phone. I simply said I needed to discuss my legal options regarding a divorce, and I needed the conversation to be confidential and immediate. She fit me in that Thursday. That same day, I opened a personal checking account at a different bank, not the one Rick and I used jointly. I transferred the equivalent of 2 months of my salary into it, which I was fully entitled to do as a co-owner of our marital assets, and which I did carefully and without drama. I also began documenting. I'm an architect. My entire professional life is built on precision, evidence, and the understanding that what you can show on paper is what exists for legal purposes. I applied that same logic to my personal situation. I created a private folder on my firm's server, password protected, backed up to a cloud account Rick didn't know about. Into it went screenshots of the phone screen I'd seen that night in March, taken discreetly when Rick was in the shower, financial statements, a log of dates, times, and incidents I now recognized as meaningful, the cologne, the late nights, the shared glances, the texts. I wasn't sure yet exactly what I was building toward, but I knew that preparation was not optional, and somewhere in the middle of that first sleepless week, the outline of a plan began to take shape. Rick had made one significant financial error during our marriage, an error I had always known about and never mentioned, because at the time it hadn't seemed relevant. 3 years ago, at the exact moment his affair with Carol was apparently beginning, he had restructured a set of personal investments in a way that minimized the appearance of our joint assets on paper. He'd mentioned it to me briefly, framed as routine tax strategy. I'd signed a document without reading it carefully enough, distracted by a project deadline. Now I read it very carefully, and I understood that what he had done, in the language of divorce law, had a specific name. I had a plan. Patricia Holt's office was on the 4th floor of a brick building on Pack Square, with windows that looked out over the Blue Ridge Mountains in the distance. It was the kind of view that made difficult conversations feel marginally more bearable. I laid everything on her desk on a Thursday morning. The documents, the screenshots, the financial log, the investment restructuring papers Rick had asked me to sign 3 years earlier. I watched Patricia's expression shift from professional neutrality to something sharper as she read. "You've been thorough," she said, which from Patricia was practically a compliment. "I'm an architect," I said. "I build things to last." We spent 2 hours going through it. The investment restructuring, Patricia confirmed, walked a very fine line, potentially the wrong side of that line in the context of divorce proceedings, where concealing or minimizing marital assets is considered dissipation. It wasn't ironclad, but it was meaningful leverage. Combined with the length of our marriage, my contributions to the household both financially and otherwise, and Rick's demonstrable relationship with my sister, which, while not legally decisive in a no-fault divorce state, could be relevant in arguments about conduct and credibility, the picture was useful. "What do you want?" Patricia asked me, not emotionally, professionally. "The house," I said. "My firm, uncontested, a fair share of the retirement accounts and the brokerage, and I want the restructuring examined properly." She nodded slowly. We'll file for divorce on the grounds of separation and begin the asset discovery process. Once we formally request documentation of all marital finances, he'll have to produce everything, including whatever that restructuring actually generated. Good, I said. I drove home feeling something I hadn't expected. Clarity. Not happiness, not even relief, but the clean, functional feeling of a structure that knows what it's meant to do. Rick was in the kitchen when I got back. He'd been walking on eggshells for days, overly polite, careful, occasionally attempting conversation that I received and answered in a tone so pleasant it seemed to unsettle him more than anger would have. He asked how my morning was. Productive, I said, and went upstairs. It was Carol who broke first. She called the following Tuesday. Not my cell phone, which I'd blocked her on, but the landline we still kept in the kitchen for Sophie's use. I happened to be the one who picked up. Diane. Her voice had that soft, practiced quality she used when she wanted something. I know you don't want to hear from me, but I think we need to talk. I agree, I said pleasantly. My attorney will be in touch. Silence. Then, your attorney? Yes, I said. Have a good afternoon, Carol. I hung up. The change in their behavior after that was immediate and instructive. Rick became less apologetic and more watchful. He started asking questions, carefully, casually, about whether I'd talked to anyone about the situation, whether I'd made any decisions. I answered everything with a version of the truth. I was still processing. I was focused on Sophie's stability. I hadn't made any final decisions, all of which was technically accurate and entirely misleading. What I was actually doing in parallel was gathering the one piece of evidence that would make everything else concrete. I knew Rick kept a secondary email account. I'd seen it open on his laptop 2 years ago and filed it away without comment. The account was linked to a Gmail address that wasn't his primary one, formatted with a slight variation on his name. I didn't have his password. What I did have was access to our home Wi-Fi router, whose admin panel I'd set up myself when we installed the system 5 years ago, and whose login credentials Rick had never thought to ask about. The router logs showed me every device connected to our network and the domains they'd accessed. I wasn't reading his emails. I wasn't hacking anything. I was looking at metadata on a network I administered, which is, Patricia confirmed when I described it hypothetically, not illegal. What the logs showed me was a consistent pattern: late-night connections from Rick's personal laptop to a vacation rental booking platform, cross-referenced with dates I now recognized as the nights he'd claimed to be traveling for work. I checked those travel dates against the expense reports he'd mentioned to me in passing. The cities didn't match. I printed the logs. Then I did something I'd been carefully timing. Sophie had a soccer game that Saturday morning. Rick always attended. While they were both gone, I drove to a storage facility on the south side of Asheville, where Rick kept a unit he'd rented 2 years ago, ostensibly for old office equipment. I had the unit number from a bill I'd seen. I didn't have a key, but what I did have was a copy of the rental agreement I'd found in a household file, which listed me as an alternate contact, which meant I could visit the facility office and request access as a co-listed party. The facility manager was apologetic but cooperative. He let me into the unit. It wasn't full of office equipment. There was a suitcase I didn't recognize, a set of bedding still in its packaging, and a shoebox containing a collection of items that told a story as clearly as any written confession. 2 sets of keys on a shared key ring, a stack of printed photographs, Rick and Carol at what looked like a beach rental, a restaurant, a hiking trail, and a birthday card in Carol's handwriting that began with a word no one writes to their brother-in-law. I photographed everything with my phone. I put everything back exactly as I'd found it. I drove home, picked up Sophie from the game, made grilled cheese for lunch, and helped her with her chemistry homework. That night, I uploaded the photographs to my private folder. I had everything I needed. Patricia filed the divorce petition on a Wednesday in late April. Rick was served at his office, which I had specifically requested, not out of cruelty, or not entirely, but because I understood that the formal, professional setting would limit his immediate reaction in ways that protected me. A man served divorce papers in front of his colleagues is less likely to drive home in a rage than a man served at his kitchen table. I was at a job site when it happened, a residential addition project in West Asheville, measuring foundation clearances in the drizzling rain. My phone rang 4 times in 30 minutes. Rick. I let each call go to voicemail. The 5th call I answered. "What did you do?" His voice had that particular quality, low, controlled, trying to sound calm. That meant he was not calm at all. "I filed for divorce," I said. "Patricia Holt is representing me. Her contact information is on the paperwork." "You couldn't have talked to me first?" I thought about that for a moment, standing in the mud with a measuring tape in my hand. Could I have? Maybe. But he had spent 3 years not talking to me first about considerably larger decisions. "No," I said. "I don't think I could have." Then I hung up. What I hadn't anticipated, though in retrospect I should have, was how quickly Rick and Carol would begin operating as a coordinated unit. Carol showed up at my firm's office 2 days after the filing. She didn't have an appointment. My receptionist, Tamara, called back to my office to let me know, and I could hear the discomfort in Tamara's voice. I told Tamara to offer Carol water and inform her I was in a meeting, which was true, and that she was welcome to wait or schedule through the proper channel. Carol waited 20 minutes and then left. That evening, Rick appeared at the house. He still had a key, which was a situation I had been in the process of legally addressing but hadn't yet resolved. He let himself in while Sophie was upstairs doing homework. I came into the front hallway and we stood looking at each other for a moment. "I need you to stop this," he said. He wasn't pleading. His tone had shifted from the apologetic register of the past weeks into something harder. "The way you filed, the timing, the office, you're trying to humiliate me." "I'm trying to divorce you," I said. "Patricia Holt is aggressive. Everyone in this city knows that. You're signaling something, and you need to think about what that means for both of us, for the kids." There it was, the pivot to the children. I'd been expecting it. "Sophie and Nathan's well-being is my primary concern," I said, "which is why I've retained a careful attorney and am proceeding through proper legal channels." "The storage unit," he said suddenly. His jaw tightened. "You went to the storage unit." I kept my face completely neutral. "I'm not going to discuss specifics with you directly. That's what attorneys are for." He stepped closer. Not threateningly, exactly, but with an energy I hadn't seen from him before, something between desperation and calculation. "Diane, if you use what's in that unit, if you make this ugly, I will make sure that your firm's finances get examined just as closely. I know about the Hargrove project." The Hargrove project. My stomach tightened, but I didn't let it show on my face. The Hargrove project was a commercial build I'd completed 4 years ago, where a subcontractor dispute had resulted in an insurance claim that was, technically, resolved correctly, but had involved a renegotiated billing arrangement that could be made to look questionable by someone motivated to make it look questionable. Rick had been aware of it at the time. I'd assumed he'd forgotten. He hadn't forgotten. "Get out of my house," I said. "Diane." Rick. My voice was very quiet. You're now trespassing in a residence that is, for the duration of these proceedings, my primary domicile. I'm going to ask you once to leave. If you don't, I'll call Patricia, and she'll call your attorney, and we'll add this visit to the file. He looked at me for a long moment. I watched him calculate. Then he left. I locked the door behind him. I stood in the hallway and breathed. The Hargrove threat was real in the sense that it could cause noise. It wasn't real in the sense that I had done anything genuinely wrong. And Patricia, when I called her the next morning and explained, agreed. Let him try, she said flatly. An allegation designed to coerce a divorcing spouse into compliance is itself a legal problem for him. Document the visit. I documented the visit. But the threat had rattled me more than I'd expected, not because it was powerful, but because it reminded me that Rick wasn't the confused, apologetic man of the past few weeks. He was strategic. He was protecting something. And now Carol was standing beside him while he did it. I needed to rest. I called my friend Lena, my oldest friend, someone who'd known me since graduate school and who was one of approximately 3 people who'd heard the full story by that point. I told her I needed a weekend away, somewhere quiet, somewhere that wasn't Asheville. She had a cottage outside Boone, 2 hours north in the mountains. She offered it without asking any questions. I dropped Sophie with my neighbor Janet, whom I trusted completely, and I drove north on a Friday afternoon with a single bag and a thermos of coffee. For 2 days, I did almost nothing. I hiked. I slept. I read a novel. I sat on Lena's porch in the cold spring air and let myself be small and quiet and temporary. By Sunday evening, I was ready. The attempt to soften me came through an unexpected channel. Rick's mother, Elaine, called me on a Tuesday morning in early May, 10 days after I'd returned from Boone and 3 weeks into formal divorce proceedings. Elaine was 71 years old, a retired school teacher from Wilmington who had always been kind to me in a careful, non-committal way. I had never had a close relationship with her, but I had always respected her, and I believed she respected me. She said she was calling because she was worried about the family. She said she hoped Rick and I might consider mediation before things went further. She said, gently but clearly, that Carol had reached out to her, which told me immediately that this call had been engineered, whatever Elaine's own good intentions might be. "Elaine," I said, "I appreciate you calling. I genuinely do. But Rick made his choices over a period of 3 years, and those choices have legal consequences that I am pursuing appropriately. I'm not angry at you, and I hope we can remain cordial, but I can't discuss the case." She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "She says you're being vindictive." I had expected this. I'd been expecting it from the moment Rick and Carol realized that a pleasant, negotiated settlement was not what I had in mind. "What I'm being," I said, "is precise. There's a difference." After we hung up, I sat with the feeling for a few minutes. Was I being vindictive? I turned the question over honestly, the way I would turn over a structural problem in a building design. Vindictive implies that the motive is punishment for its own sake. What I was doing was different. I was pursuing what was rightfully mine, with documentation, through legal channels, and I was not extending mercy to people who had not extended honesty to me. That wasn't vindictiveness. That was accuracy. I let the feeling go. Carol made her own attempt the following week. She sent a handwritten letter, actual paper, actually handwritten, which I had to admit took a certain nerve, delivered to my firm's office. It was 2 pages long. In it, she described her feelings for Rick as something that had arrived without her permission, a force she'd tried to resist before surrendering to it. She described her guilt. She described missing me. She asked at the end whether I could find any space for understanding. I read it once, carefully, all the way through. Then I placed it in the evidence folder, not because it contained anything legally useful, it didn't particularly, but because it was a document that revealed strategy. The letter was, beneath its emotional language, a probing maneuver. It was asking, how much anger is there? How irrational is she? Can we appeal to her sentimentality? The answer to those questions, as far as Carol and Rick needed to know, was none available. I did not reply to the letter. I watched them adjust. Rick became quieter in his communications. His attorney's messages through Patricia were notably more measured than they'd been in the first aggressive week. Carol went silent on all channels. They were recalibrating, waiting to see what I would do next. That suited me perfectly. What I was doing in the absence of their noise was building. The social architecture of divorce, I was learning, matters as much as the legal architecture. Who knows what, when, and how? These things shape perception, and perception shapes outcomes. I had been deliberate about disclosure from the beginning, telling the story to only those who needed to know it, and telling it calmly, factually, without theatrical displays of suffering. I told Nathan. That conversation happened over a video call one Sunday evening, and it was the hardest thing I had done in the entire process. He was 19 and still figuring out how to be a person, and I was asking him to absorb information that would restructure his understanding of his family. I told him plainly without editorializing, and I told him that whatever relationship he wanted to have with his father going forward was his own choice to make. He cried. I cried. We stayed on the call for 2 hours. By the end, he was asking practical questions. Could he still come home for summer? Was the house safe? Which told me he was going to be okay. Sophie was harder in different ways. She was 16 and perceptive, and she'd already sensed that something was wrong. I sat with her one evening after dinner and told her that her dad and I were separating and that it was an adult situation between us that had nothing to do with her. I didn't tell her about Carol. That conversation would come later, when she was ready on her own terms. She took it the way teenagers sometimes take enormous things, quietly with a controlled face, and then cried in her room for an hour while I sat outside her door and didn't pretend not to hear. I had friends. More than I'd realized, actually. Lena was constant. My colleague, Marco, who ran a competing architecture firm and had been my professional friend for 8 years, took me to lunch and listened without offering unsolicited opinions, which I deeply appreciated. My neighbor Janet, who had kept Sophie for the Boone weekend, had grown up in a family fractured by a parent's affair and understood the specific texture of this kind of loss. She brought food, practical, unrequested food, a lasagna, a container of soup, which is the right thing to do and which I will never forget. I was not alone, and in not being alone, I was stronger than Rick and Carol had apparently assumed I would be. They were watching for collapse. Instead, they were watching me stand up straighter. They came together, which told me everything. It was a Saturday afternoon in mid-May, 5 weeks into formal proceedings. Sophie was at a birthday party. I was home alone, drafting specifications for a residential project. The doorbell rang, and when I opened the door, both of them were standing on my front porch. Rick in a linen shirt, Carol in a soft blue dress, both arranged in postures of careful, practiced reasonableness. I stood in the doorway and didn't invite them in. "We wanted to talk," Rick said, "not through attorneys, just the 3 of us like adults." I looked at them for a moment. Carol met my eyes briefly and then looked at the porch floor. Rick held my gaze. "You can say what you came to say from there," I said. Rick's jaw tightened slightly, but he proceeded. The core of what they presented over the next 10 minutes on my front porch was a proposal, a negotiated settlement outside of Patricia's framework that would allow us all to move forward with dignity. Rick had prepared talking points. I could tell by the cadence, the careful transitions. The settlement they were proposing would give me the house, a fixed sum from the brokerage account, and a clean separation. In exchange, I would drop the formal asset discovery inquiry and agree to a mutual non-disparagement clause. Non-disparagement, meaning I couldn't tell the full story of what had happened to anyone who might matter. I waited until he finished. What you're describing, I said, is a settlement that benefits you significantly and constrains me significantly, dressed up as fairness. The asset discovery process exists because there are questions about marital finances that have not been answered. I'm not dropping it. Carol spoke for the first time. Diane. Her voice had that quality again. Soft, slightly wounded, tuned for sympathy. I know how much pain I've caused you. I'm not asking you to forgive me. I'm asking you to think about what this level of conflict does to your children, to Nathan, to Sophie. There it was. The children, invoked by the person who had spent 3 years helping to fracture their family. I think about my children constantly, I said pleasantly, which is why I'm ensuring their mother receives what she's legally entitled to. You're making this vindictive, Rick said, and his voice had lost some of its careful reasonableness. The storage unit, the router logs. You've been building a case for months. That's not a woman processing grief. That's someone running a campaign. Yes, I said, it is. That seemed to surprise him. I'm an architect, Rick. I build things. I've been building a case carefully and correctly because you gave me cause to. If you'd wanted to avoid this, you had 3 years of opportunities. Something shifted in Carol's posture. She stepped slightly forward and her expression changed, the soft, wounded quality dropping away into something cooler and more direct. You need to think very carefully, she said quietly, about what happens to your professional reputation when we start talking about the Hargrove project. We've already consulted with someone who thinks there's a real story there, a story that could cost you clients. This was the actual threat. The porch conversation had started as a peace overture and was now revealing itself as what it actually was, a pressure campaign. I felt fear, real physical fear, a cold contraction in my chest, because I understood that they were not bluffing about the Hargrove project. They would pursue it. They would make noise. And in a small city where professional reputation is relationships, noise costs money even when it's baseless. I breathed through it. I've discussed the Hargrove project with my attorney, I said, and with my professional liability insurer. If you pursue that line, you're welcome to. It will become part of the court record of this divorce, documented as coercive conduct, which will be interesting for Rick's professional reputation, considering the compliance standards of his firm. Rick worked for a wealth management company. Compliance and conduct standards in that industry are not casual. The implication was precise, and he understood it. A silence passed between us that was not comfortable. I'd like you to leave my property now, I said. I said it without heat, without trembling, without anything in my voice that they could use. Carol looked at Rick. Rick looked at the porch floor. Then they turned and walked to the car without another word. I closed the front door. I went to the kitchen, sat down at the table, and pressed my hands flat against the wood. The fear was still there. I let it be there. I'd learned by this point that the fear wasn't a signal to retreat. It was a signal that what I was doing mattered, that the stakes were real, that I was right to take this seriously. I opened my laptop and wrote a detailed account of the conversation, time-stamped, including Carol's specific words about the Hargrove project. I emailed it to Patricia before the hour was out. Then I called Nathan because I needed to hear his voice and because he'd become, unexpectedly, one of my steadier points of contact through all of this. My 19-year-old son, who had absorbed the news of his parents' dissolution and was still stubbornly calling me every other day to check in. We talked for 40 minutes about nothing in particular: his classes, a new friend he'd made in his dorm, a restaurant he'd discovered in Chapel Hill, normal, ongoing life. By the time we hung up, I was steady again. The deposition was scheduled for a Thursday in June. In North Carolina divorce proceedings, depositions aren't always required, but Patricia had pushed for them given the asset complexity and Rick's Hargrove threat, which she wanted neutralized publicly and on record. Rick's attorney, a man named Gerald Foss who communicated exclusively in a tone of barely concealed impatience, had objected. The judge had allowed it. We met in a conference room at Patricia's office, all of us arranged around a long mahogany table. Patricia and me on one side, Gerald Foss and Rick on the other, a court reporter at the head. The morning light came through tall windows onto polished wood. Carol was not present. She had declined to be deposed voluntarily. A subpoena was in preparation. I had spent 3 evenings that week preparing with Patricia, not rehearsing false answers, but reviewing true ones, understanding which questions were designed to destabilize and how to answer them without being destabilized. The goal, Patricia reminded me, was not to win an argument. The goal was to be precise. Let the record speak. Rick went first. What emerged during his deposition was a slow unraveling, not dramatic, not a single moment of exposure, but the cumulative effect of a man trying to maintain multiple inconsistent positions simultaneously. Gerald Foss had coached him well on the major questions, but the investment restructuring, the specific maneuver from 3 years ago, which Patricia had spent weeks with a forensic accountant unpacking, was where the consistency failed. The restructuring had moved a portion of appreciation from a jointly held brokerage account into a separate instrument titled Only in Rick's Name, using a methodology that the forensic accountant characterized as consistent with intentional asset segregation in anticipation of marital dissolution. Rick testified that it had been a routine tax strategy. Patricia produced the forensic accountant's report. She produced the dates. The restructuring had occurred 7 months after Rick and Carol's relationship, by Rick's own admission in preliminary disclosures, had begun. She produced the fact that Rick had not consulted a tax professional before making the restructuring. She had subpoenaed his accountant's records, and that the tax benefit he claimed was the motivation had not, in fact, materialized. And then she produced the vacation rental records, the router log metadata I documented, the rental platform bookings, 8 separate trips over 30 months, booked under Rick's personal credit card, to locations that did not correspond to his stated business travel, all of which had been disclosed in the financial discovery process because Patricia had been relentless in requesting it. Rick's composure, which had been considerable at the start of the morning, was showing cracks by 11 o'clock. "Were these personal trips?" Patricia asked. "Some of them, yes," he said carefully. "Were they taken with Carol Whitfield?" A pause. Gerald Foss made a murmured objection. Patricia clarified the relevance. The court reporter typed, "Some of them," Rick said. "All 8? Another pause. "Longer. I'd have to check." Your credit card records show consistent charges in these locations to restaurants, accommodations, and one recurring charge to a florist. Do you recall what the flowers were for?" Rick looked at the table. I sat very still beside Patricia and looked at nothing in particular and felt a quietness inside me that I hadn't expected. Not triumph, not anger, something more like the feeling of watching a structure that was never sound finally settle into what it actually was. My deposition followed in the afternoon. Gerald Foss was precise and pointed. He asked about the Hargrove project. I answered every question directly, without defensiveness, with specific dates and documentation I'd brought. The renegotiated billing arrangement had been disclosed to the insurance company at the time. The subcontractor dispute had been adjudicated. There was nothing to find. Foss moved on. He asked about the storage unit access. I explained calmly that as a co-listed party on the rental agreement, I had legal right of access, that I had gone through the facility's standard process, and that I had not removed anything. He asked if I had photographed the contents. "Yes," I said. "Why?" "Because I'm a careful person," I said. The critical moment, the one I'd been preparing for without quite knowing it, came near the end of the afternoon when Foss attempted to reframe the asset restructuring as something I had implicitly approved. "You signed the restructuring authorization," he said, "in 2023. "I did," I said. "So you were aware of the transaction." "I signed a document my husband presented to me as routine paperwork," I said, "while managing a residential project with a 2-week deadline and raising 2 teenagers. I relied on his representation of its purpose. That reliance in the context of a 20-year marriage was reasonable." Patricia had told me that the legal standard for marital financial transactions involves a concept called fiduciary duty. Spouses owe each other a duty of honesty in financial dealings. Rick had breached it. My signing in good faith did not constitute approval. I said all of this calmly, from memory, looking at Gerald Foss with the same expression I use when a contractor tells me a structural element is fine and I know from the drawings that it isn't. After the deposition ended, Patricia walked me to the elevator. "You were excellent," she said. "I was accurate," I said. I drove home and made dinner for Sophie and let myself feel, just briefly, the particular satisfaction of a foundation correctly laid. The settlement was reached in late July, 6 weeks after the depositions. Rick did not want to go to trial. His attorney did not want to go to trial. The forensic accountant's report on the investment restructuring had been shared in discovery, and its conclusions, consistent with intentional asset segregation, were the kind of language that, in a courtroom, would become the story. Gerald Foss was experienced enough to recognize a losing position. Patricia sat across from Foss in a conference room for 4 hours on a Friday. I was not present for the negotiation. Patricia preferred to work without clients in the room, and I trusted her judgment. I spent those 4 hours at my firm reviewing drawings for a project that was nothing to do with any of this, which was exactly where I needed my mind to be. She called me at 2:30 in the afternoon. "We have a settlement," she said. I put down my pencil. "Tell me." The terms were these: the house, in full, transferred to me. The brokerage account split 60-40 in my favor, which reflected the forensic accountant's calculation of the value that had been improperly segregated, plus a reasonable, equitable share. Rick's 401k, split 50-50, which was standard for the length of our marriage. My firm, uncontested. Rick had withdrawn all claims to any interest in it. Spousal support for 4 years, which Patricia had negotiated given my contributions to the household during the marriage and the documented financial deception, and a non-disparagement clause, mutual, meaning neither of us could publicly disparage the other, which I accepted because I had no interest in waging a public campaign. The record existed. That was enough. The Hargrove threat had vanished entirely from the negotiation. Foss had not raised it once during the settlement discussion, which told me that upon examination, they'd determined it was unworkable. I filed that information away without satisfaction or surprise. It was the outcome Patricia had predicted. I signed the settlement agreement on a Monday morning in Patricia's office, with the mountains visible through the windows. Rick had signed separately in Foss's office the previous Friday. We did not sign together. There was no reason to be in the same room. What happened to Carol in the months that followed was not something I engineered, though some people assumed I had. The deposition transcript, once available through the court process, was a matter of record. In a professional community the size of Asheville's, records have a way of circulating. Carol worked in marketing for a regional nonprofit. Within the organization, a board member became aware of her role in the circumstances, specifically the nature and duration of the relationship documented in the deposition. The board member raised the question of judgment and institutional trust in an organization that worked with families in crisis. Carol resigned in September. I heard this from Janet, who heard it from someone who knew someone on the board. I did not comment on it. I was not involved. Rick's situation at his firm was more directly consequential. The forensic accountant's report, combined with the deposition testimony about the restructuring, had included a notation that the transaction pattern was being flagged to his firm's compliance department. A standard step, Patricia had explained, when financial deception in a marital context involves instruments connected to a financial professional's accounts. Rick's firm opened an internal compliance review in August. By October, he had left the company. The language used was mutual agreement, which is the professional equivalent of a settlement agreement. The story that circulated in financial circles was fragmentary but damaging enough. He moved out of Asheville entirely by November. I heard he was in Charlotte. I did not verify this. I want to be precise about something. I did not feel victorious. Victory implies a contest, and contests have defined endpoints. What I felt on the Monday morning I signed that agreement was something more like returning to level ground after a long and exhausting climb. Not triumphant, just standing upright on solid ground in a house that was mine. Sophie knew, by this point, the full story. I had told her carefully over 2 conversations in August and September as the settlement was being finalized. She was angry in the specific, clean, adolescent way that is actually a sign of healthy, moral reasoning. She chose not to speak to her father for a period of 3 months. That was her choice to make. I didn't encourage it or discourage it. Nathan drove home from Chapel Hill the weekend after the settlement signed. He helped me repaint the living room, a soft, warm white, replacing the gray-green we'd chosen together years ago. We worked for a Saturday and listened to music and talked about nothing important. And at some point in the afternoon, I looked at my son, paint on his forearms, laughing at something on the radio, and I thought, this is what remains. This is what holds. I kept the Craftsman bungalow on the hill in Asheville, the one I had designed and renovated with my own hands. I kept everything that mattered. The autumn after the settlement felt like the first season I'd been fully present for in years. I refinished the kitchen table, the same table where Rick had made his confession, which I'd considered replacing and then decided to keep, because it was a good table and it had nothing to answer for. I had dinner parties with people I actually wanted to see. Lena, Marco and his husband, Janet, a couple from my hiking group. Good food, conversation that went from serious to ridiculous without warning. the ease of being around people who aren't performing anything for you. My firm had its best financial year on record. A referral from Marco brought a significant new client, a hotel group developing a boutique property in Asheville, the kind of project I'd wanted for years. I hired a second architect, Rosa, whose precision reminded me of my younger self. I started hiking seriously, most Saturday mornings into the Blue Ridge, coming home cleaner in some way I didn't need to articulate. In February, I met someone. His name was Daniel, a structural engineer, professionally convenient and privately amusing, divorced with a 12-year-old daughter he clearly adored, quiet in a way that felt like substance rather than withholding. Not Rick. In every relevant way, not Rick. I told him the outline of the past year early on. He listened without judgment, then said, "That sounds like it required a lot of strength." I decided it was true. Sophie appeared for dinner one Sunday in March and was, by the end of the evening, telling Daniel about her soccer season with the fluency of someone who had decided, tentatively, to accept a new thing. Nathan came home for summer, refinished the back porch railing, and returned to Chapel Hill with a settling to him, as if something uncertain had clarified. And what of Rick and Carol? Rick's departure from his firm had not been the clean, mutual agreement its language implied. A compliance review identified conduct that, while not criminal, constituted serious professional misconduct. He was barred from certain financial advisory activities for 3 years and found work in Charlotte at significantly reduced compensation. Carol found no new position in Asheville's nonprofit sector. Her departure circumstances, known among board members in a small community, made recommendations difficult. She moved to Charlotte, leaving behind the network she'd spent 15 years building. I heard they argued bitterly about money, with a mutual resentment that relationships begun in deception sometimes develop. I heard this without satisfaction or sorrow. It was information, nothing more. What I had instead was my firm, my house, my children, my mountains, and my Saturday mornings in terrain that asked nothing of me but attention. In October, driving Nathan